Welcome back to the Alibi Club, where every mystery is a case file waiting to be reopened. San Francisco, late 1960s. The city was alive with music, protests, and dreams of freedom. But lurking behind the golden glow of the Bay Area was something darker, something that made the city's heart pound with dread. They called him the Zodiac Killer, not because anyone knew his name, but because he chose it, signing taunting letters with a cryptic circle and cross symbol that would forever mark America's criminal history. This is not just the story of murders, it's the story of letters, puzzles, and shadows. It's about a faceless predator who made the police, the press, and the public his unwilling audience. Each note he sent was a riddle, a dare, and a confession wrapped into one. What kind of killer writes his own legend while hiding in plain sight? Tonight, in the Alibi Club, we open the envelope together. On the night of December 20th, 1968, a lonely stretch of road in Vallejo, California, became the backdrop for what many would later call the beginning of a nightmare. Lover's Lane was the kind of place where young couples parked their cars, seeking privacy under the wide, cold sky. It was also the kind of place where innocence and vulnerability converged. That night, teenagers Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday parked David's Rambler station wagon on Lake Herman Road. They probably thought they had the evening to themselves. What they couldn't have known was that a silent hunter had chosen them, and their car, as the first victims in a game that would terrify the Bay Area. At around 11 p.m., another vehicle pulled up near them. Witnesses later spoke of cars parked and moving in that area, but none could identify what happened next. What is known is that a man approached their vehicle, forcing them out at gunpoint. David was shot once in the head at close range, collapsing beside the car. Betty Lou ran. Her body was found more than 30 feet away, bullets in her back marking her desperate sprint for life. 10 casings lay on the ground, each one a signature. It was a crime cold, clinical, and terrifyingly impersonal. The police arrived, bewildered. Who would kill two teenagers out in the dark like that? There was no robbery. Betty Lou still wore her rings, her purse untouched. There was no sexual assault. There was only death, swift and senseless. Without a motive, the murders seemed random, and yet, randomness can often be the cruelest mask of all. Just 6 months later, on the night of July 4, 1969, Vallejo was once again the scene of horror. Darlene Ferrin, a young woman with an outgoing personality and a long list of admirers, drove her car to Blue Rock Springs Park with a friend, Michael Majo. It was meant to be a night of fireworks and celebration. Instead, it became the Zodiac's second act. As they sat in her car, another vehicle pulled in behind them. Its headlights washed over the park, then suddenly switched off. At first, Darlene and Michael thought little of it. Couples parked in that area often. But the stillness stretched too long, and unease crept in. Moments later, a man approached with a flashlight and gun. Without a word, he fired into the car. Michael was hit multiple times, but somehow clung to life. Darlene, struck 5 times, would not survive. And then came the moment that defined everything. Around 12:40 a.m., a call was made to Vallejo Police Department. The voice on the other end was calm, deliberate, almost casual. The man confessed to the Blue Rock Springs shooting and claimed responsibility for the murders of Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday. "I also killed those kids last year," he said, before hanging up. This wasn't just a killer. It was a man who wanted to be heard, to be acknowledged. That phone call changed everything. This was no random spree. This was a performance, and soon the letters began. The police investigation into the first killings revealed very little. Shell casings linked the two crimes together, suggesting the same weapon had been used, but motive remained elusive. Neither Betty Lou nor David had known enemies. Darlene was popular, but no clear suspect emerged from her circle of friends and acquaintances. The surviving witness, Michael, described the attacker vaguely, possibly in his late 20s to early 30s, with a stocky build and short hair. It was enough to form a picture in the mind, but not enough to make an arrest. More importantly, though, the killer had revealed his desire for attention. He didn't just want to kill. He wanted his crimes announced, printed, feared. His phone call wasn't a slip of conscience. It was the opening of a conversation. He had introduced himself, not with a name, but with violence. And soon he would adopt a moniker that the press, the police, and the public would never forget. Zodiac. What stood out most in these early days was the theatricality. Here was someone who wasn't content to vanish into the shadows after the act. He wanted a stage, an audience. He wanted to provoke, to mock, to make law enforcement chase a ghost they couldn't quite touch. The first murders were more than crimes. They were the foundation of a myth. In the aftermath, Vallejo police scrambled. Was this a madman on the loose? Or someone methodical? Someone who planned each detail with precision? The brutality of the crimes suggested one thing, but the taunting phone call suggested another. He was no ordinary predator. He was a predator who wanted to be famous. In the weeks that followed, officers warned residents to be cautious, especially in isolated areas. But how does one defend against an enemy who chooses targets at random? Parents warned their children. Couples thought twice before driving into the quiet dark, and every shadow on a lonely road seemed to carry menace. No one could yet imagine the letters, the ciphers, the strange codes that would follow. No one could yet picture the crude drawings of crosshairs that would soon grace headlines. But in those first few murders, the pattern was clear. The Zodiac wasn't killing for need. He was killing for narrative, for fear, for recognition. And with every bullet he fired, with every body that fell, he was writing the first lines of his own terrifying story, a story he would force the public to read, one letter at a time. On August 1st, 1969, the Bay Area newspapers became the unlikely recipients of one of the most infamous correspondences in American crime history. 3 separate letters arrived on the same day, delivered to the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Each letter was handwritten, each bore the same crosshair-like symbol, and each contained a demand: publish the letter on the front page of the paper, or more people would die. The letters were chilling in their bluntness. In them, the author claimed responsibility for the murders of Betty Lou Jensen, David Faraday, and Darlene Ferrin. He detailed elements of the crimes that had not been released to the public, such as the number of shots fired and the positions of the bodies. This wasn't the rambling of a hoaxer. Whoever had written the letters had been there, he had killed, and he wanted everyone to know it. But the letters contained more than confessions. Each packet included a third of a cryptogram, a coded message filled with strange symbols, triangles, circles, and letters arranged in a meticulous grid. The killer demanded that the papers publish the codes so that the public could read them, warning that failure to comply would lead to more deaths. He also hinted that the solution to the cipher would reveal his identity. "In this cipher is my identity," he wrote. It was an audacious move. The newspapers, accustomed to crank letters, quickly realized this was different. The details were too precise, the confidence too chilling. They complied, printing the letters and ciphers in their weekend editions. Readers across Northern California were suddenly staring at the killer's puzzle, wondering if the answer lay hidden in the strange hieroglyphs. For the first time, the Zodiac had brought his audience into the act. The public response was immediate. Amateur codebreakers across the state, even across the country, tried their hand at cracking the ciphers. Some saw it as a challenge, others as a way to help the police. For the Zodiac, it was a perfect outcome. He had turned murder into a game, and the public was playing along. Behind the scenes, police struggled with the sheer audacity of what they faced. Vallejo detectives, along with the California Department of Justice, scrambled to investigate the letters. But the Zodiac was always one step ahead. His writing style was taunting, playful, almost mocking. He spoke of his collection of slaves for the afterlife, a phrase so bizarre and unnerving it left investigators questioning whether they were dealing with madness, sadism, or something worse. The ciphers themselves posed an immediate problem. Cryptographers in law enforcement were skilled, but the killer's demand had transformed the puzzle into a public obsession. Ordinary citizens flooded the newspapers and police with attempted solutions. Some saw patterns, others invented them. But it wasn't until a school teacher named Donald Harden and his wife Betty from Salinas, California sat down with the cipher that progress was made. Working together, they applied common sense and intuition rather than advanced cryptography. They noticed repeating patterns, guessed at common words like kill and I, and slowly the code began to unravel. After 20 hours of work, the message emerged, not a revelation of the killer's name, but a chilling manifesto. "I like killing people, because it is so much fun," the decoded message read. "It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest, because man is the most dangerous animal of all." He compared his murders to hunting, describing the thrill of watching victims die. He boasted about collecting slaves to serve him in the afterlife. And, crucially, he ended with a taunt. "I will not give you my name because you will try to slow down or stop my collecting of slaves." The promise of identity had been a lie, a manipulation. The cipher revealed not the man, but the myth he wanted to build. He wanted people to see him as more than a killer. He wanted them to see him as eternal, as unstoppable, as a force beyond the reach of police or morality. For investigators, the decoded message was both a breakthrough and a dead end. It confirmed the killer's authorship of the letters, provided a chilling window into his psyche, and proved his intelligence. But it revealed nothing about his true identity. He remained a shadow, a phantom who wrote in riddles and left bodies in his wake. The newspapers, meanwhile, had unwittingly become the Zodiac stage. By printing his words, they had amplified his voice. He had manipulated them, and they had little choice but to comply. After all, how could they risk ignoring him, if more lives were at stake? This was part of his genius. He had found a way to make murder into headline news, his every letter forcing the public to listen. As the weeks turned to months, the letters continued. Some were short, some long, but all carried the same air of superiority, the same hunger for attention. He ridiculed the police, mocked the investigators, and threatened future killings. He played with the city like a puppeteer tugging strings, confident that no one could cut the cords. By then, a pattern had become clear. The Zodiac was not just a killer but a writer, an author of his own legend. He didn't want money. He didn't want material gain. He wanted something more intangible, more intoxicating, fear, and through his letters, he achieved it. Every family that opened the morning paper, every student who tried to crack the ciphers, every officer who stayed up late rereading his taunts, they were all part of his audience. The first letters had set the tone for everything that followed. The Zodiac Killer was no longer just a murderer. He was a storyteller, writing his tale in blood and ink, and the world, horrified yet fascinated, couldn't look away. By late 1969, the Zodiac had become more than a name in the papers. He had become a presence, an unseen force whispering in every empty street, in every lonely drive home after dark. His letters had transformed him into something mythic, but his next move would remind everyone that he was not just words on a page. He was still out there, still hunting, and this time he would take his theatrics to a horrifying new level. On September 27th, 1969, Lake Berryessa was the kind of place that seemed a world away from the fear gripping San Francisco. The air was crisp, the water calm, and the golden hills rolled out under the autumn sun. College students Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard had driven out for a peaceful afternoon by the water, a picnic blanket spread beneath the oak trees, books and snacks scattered about. It was the kind of day that should have ended in laughter, not blood. But as the sun dipped lower, Cecilia noticed something across the hillside. A man was approaching. At first it seemed ordinary enough. People often hiked the area. Yet as he came closer, unease crept in. He was dressed in an executioner-style hood, black fabric draped over his head with clip-on sunglasses covering the eye holes. Across his chest, crudely stitched, was the now infamous Zodiac symbol, a cross within a circle. In his hands he carried a gun and lengths of rope. What followed was a scene unlike any in American crime history. Calmly, almost methodically, the Zodiac told the couple he was an escaped convict from Montana, that he needed their car and money to flee to Mexico. He ordered Cecilia and Brian to tie each other's wrists with the cord he provided. When Brian attempted to loosen his bindings, the Zodiac tightened them himself, making sure they couldn't escape. Then, without hesitation, he pulled out a knife and attacked. He stabbed Brian 6 times in the back, each plunge deliberate. He then turned on Cecilia, stabbing her 10 times in a frenzy of violence. When it was done, he walked away, leaving them bleeding on the ground beneath the California sky. But his performance wasn't set over. Before leaving, the Zodiac walked to Brian Sipp's car, pulled out a black marker, and scrawled on the door, Vallejo, December 20th, 68, July 4th, 69, September 27th, 69, 6:30, by knife. The dates referenced his previous murders. The message was a grotesque confession written directly on the victim's vehicle, signed with his symbol. It was his way of saying, "This is me, I did this, and I will keep going." Hours later, the Zodiac called the Napa County Sheriff's Office from a payphone to report the crime, once again speaking with the calm detachment of a man discussing a simple chore. "I want to report a murder," he said. "No, a double murder. They are 2 miles north of park headquarters. They were in a white Volkswagen Carmen Ghia." Then he hung up. Cecilia, tragically, would not survive her injuries. Brian, against all odds, lived to tell the story. His testimony gave police the clearest description yet of the killer's bizarre costume, and his voice, calm, low, deliberate. For investigators, the attack was both a gift and a curse. They had a witness who had seen the Zodiac up close, but they also had proof that the killer was evolving. He was no longer hiding in the shadows with a gun. He was creating a spectacle, staging his crimes like theater. And this, perhaps, is what made him so uniquely terrifying. He wasn't just killing, he was performing, dressing himself in symbols and rituals, turning violence into ritualistic theater. The mask, the emblem, the message on the car door, these were not the acts of a man desperate to avoid capture. These were the acts of a man who wanted to be remembered. It's moments like this where the story demands we pause and reflect. Viewers, wherever you are right now, whether you're in your living room late at night, on a bus with headphones in, or drifting towards sleep, take a moment to look around. Where are you watching from? What time is it as you listen to this story unfold? The Zodiac always wanted an audience, and tonight, in some strange way, you've become part of it. The attack at Lake Berryessa shocked the public because it shattered the idea that the Zodiac was simply a gunman in the dark. His costume revealed a theatrical imagination, one that was almost medieval in its horror. He wanted his victims, and by extension the entire community, to see him as larger than life, a faceless executioner who could appear anywhere. For the police, the case was becoming a labyrinth. They had letters, ciphers, survivors, and evidence, but no clear suspect. The Napa County Sheriff's Department worked alongside Vallejo and San Francisco police, but the Zodiac was always ahead, always moving. His crimes crossed jurisdictions, forcing multiple departments to share information in a time when cooperation was less seamless than today. By now, the Zodiac had established a pattern: kill, confess, taunt, but his appetite for attention was growing. He wasn't just satisfied with being feared in one county or one city. He wanted the entire Bay Area under his shadow, and soon, he would bring his terror into the heart of San Francisco itself. Lake Berryessa was more than just another attack. It was a declaration. The Zodiac wanted the world to know he wasn't bound by pattern or method. He could strike with a gun, or with a knife. He could kill in darkness, or in broad daylight. He could appear as an ordinary man, or as a hooded spectre, and most chilling of all, he could vanish afterward, slipping back into anonymity, as if he had never been there at all. The stage was set for his next act, and it would be his boldest yet. San Francisco in October 1969 was alive with its usual rhythm. The bustle of cable cars, the fog rolling across the bay, the city lights painting the night. But in the quiet neighborhood of Presidio Heights, the Zodiac Killer struck again, leaving behind one of the most audacious murders in his reign of terror. Unlike his previous attacks on couples in secluded areas, this one was committed in the middle of a city street, almost daring the police to catch him in the act. On the evening of October 11th, Paul Stein, a 29-year-old cab driver, picked up a fare at the intersection of Mason and Geary streets. His passenger requested to be taken to Presidio Heights, an upscale neighborhood far from the lovers' lanes the Zodiac had haunted. For Paul, it must have seemed like just another late-night ride. But by 9:55 p.m., his cab rolled to a stop at the corner of Washington and Cherry Streets, and within minutes, Paul Stein would be dead. A single gunshot to the back of his head ended his life instantly. But the Zodiac didn't flee. Instead, he lingered inside the cab, meticulously tearing away a piece of Stein's blood-stained shirt. He wiped down surfaces, likely to remove fingerprints, before casually stepping out. In full view of the street, he calmly walked away, blending into the darkness as though nothing had happened. What the killer didn't anticipate was that children across the street were watching. From a window, they saw the entire scene unfold. They called the police, reporting a man wiping down the taxi before walking off toward the Presidio, the sprawling park and former military base nearby. Their description was chillingly clear: a stocky white male, approximately 35-45 years old, with a round face and glasses. Unlike his hooded performance at Lake Berryessa, here the Zodiac appeared unmasked, an ordinary man in ordinary clothes. Patrol officers raced to the scene. Within minutes, San Francisco police were swarming the neighborhood. But fate played a cruel trick. A dispatcher mistakenly described the suspect as a black male, not white. When two officers spotted a stocky white man, calmly walking just blocks away from the murder scene, they let him pass without question. They would later realize, with horror, that they may have come face to face with the Zodiac himself. The crime scene evidence was stark. Paul Stein's lifeless body slumped in the driver's seat, the cab's meter still running. A bloody fingerprint was lifted from the door panel, though whether it belonged to the killer or not remains uncertain. But the most damning piece of evidence wasn't at the scene at all. Days later, the San Francisco Chronicle received another letter. Inside was a piece of Paul Stein's shirt, stained with his blood. It was irrefutable proof. The Zodiac had killed again, and this time he wanted everyone to know. The letter mocked the police for failing to catch him, even as they closed in on his location. He bragged about walking past patrol cars and disappearing into the Presidio while searchlights swept the park. His taunts were deliberate, calculated to humiliate. The SFPD could have caught me last night if they had searched the park properly, he sneered. With that, he cemented his reputation as not just a killer, but a predator who thrived on outsmarting those who hunted him. For San Francisco, the murder of Paul Stein marked a terrifying escalation. The Zodiac was no longer content with secluded lovers' lanes or rural hideaways. He had brought his violence into the heart of the city, targeting a random working man in plain view of witnesses. The randomness was part of the message. No one was safe, anywhere, at any time. The Presidio Heights case also revealed just how vulnerable law enforcement was to his tactics. The mistaken suspect description haunted the San Francisco Police Department. Officers who realized they had possibly encountered the killer lived with that regret for years. Every detail seemed to highlight his ability to manipulate chance, turning small errors into victories that fed his legend. Public fear reached new heights. Parents warned their children not to ride alone in taxis. City residents avoided walking in quiet neighborhoods after dark. For many, the Zodiac's letters became morning terrors, printed in bold across the front pages. His words weren't just evidence, they were psychological weapons, spreading unease far beyond the crime scenes. And then there was the shirt. That gruesome fragment became his calling card. Proof that he could reach into the city and take a life whenever he pleased. Each time police or journalists questioned whether his letters were authentic, another piece of the shirt would arrive, silencing all doubt. The relic of Paul Stein's murder turned the Zodiac's correspondence into something more than ink on paper. It was blood on paper, a chilling reminder that behind the words was a real killer, still at large. The Presidio Heights killing forced the public to reckon with a terrifying truth. The Zodiac was unpredictable. He could stage theatrical attacks in the countryside, then shift to a cold execution in the city. He could write ciphers filled with strange symbols one week, then send a blood-stained cloth the next. He refused to be contained by pattern, and that refusal made him all the more frightening. For the police, each new letter was a reminder of their failure. For the public, each headline was a reminder of their vulnerability. And for the Zodiac, each taunt was fuel, proof that he controlled the narrative, that he was not just killing people, but rewriting the city's sense of safety. By now, the name Zodiac had taken on a life of its own. It wasn't just the pseudonym of a killer, it was a specter, an idea that haunted every empty street corner, every late-night taxi ride, every quiet park bench. And as the city reeled, the Zodiac prepared his next act, turning his letters into a stage for threats, fantasies and games that no one could ignore. By the autumn of 1969, San Francisco wasn't just living with the Zodiac, it was living under him. His letters had already shaken the public, his ciphers had turned amateur sleuths into obsessives, and his murders had forced police to admit they were dealing with an enemy who seemed to thrive on chaos. But it wasn't enough for him to terrify couples in the night or mock the police with bloody trophies. The Zodiac wanted something bigger, a city held hostage to his imagination. In one of his most infamous letters, sent to the San Francisco Chronicle just days after the murder of Paul Stein, the Zodiac unveiled his next act. In cold, deliberate words, he threatened to attack a school bus. His plan, he explained, was to shoot out the tires, force the bus to a stop, and then pick off the children as they come bouncing out. It was a new kind of horror, not just murder, but the threat of mass murder, of targeting society at its most vulnerable. Parents across the Bay Area clutched their children tighter, suddenly fearful of something as ordinary as the morning ride to school. Teachers glanced nervously at classroom windows, scanning for shadows that weren't there. Bus drivers, once invisible workers, became frontline guardians of lives, too fragile to comprehend the evil that now stalked them. The police response was immediate. Officers were assigned to shadow school buses, following their routes in unmarked cars. Parents volunteered to patrol neighborhoods, For a time, the idea of children being targeted by a faceless killer consumed San Francisco's collective psyche. The fear was so visceral that even without action, the Zodiac had already achieved his goal: control. He didn't need to fire a single bullet. His words alone paralyzed an entire community. The school bus threat was the perfect example of how the Zodiac blurred the line between murder and theater. He had discovered that words, strategically chosen, could wield as much power as any weapon. By describing the attack in chilling detail, he planted images in the minds of thousands, forcing them to imagine what he had not yet done. The violence lived first in their imaginations, and that was enough. For investigators, this escalation posed a new challenge. They had been chasing a killer, but now they were chasing a terrorist. Someone who could destabilize public life with a few sentences. The question wasn't just how to catch him. It was how to contain the panic. Newspapers debated whether publishing his letters played into his hands, amplifying his threats. But how could they withhold information when children's lives might be at risk? The Zodiac had cornered them into a no-win situation, and he knew it. This period also marked a shift in his tone. His letters became more theatrical, more grandiose. He referred to himself as the Zodiac in bold declarations, embedding his symbol like a signature seal. He described his collection of slaves for the afterlife in greater detail, weaving mythology into his crimes. He even mocked police directly, inventing riddles about his location and daring them to solve puzzles that led nowhere. The killings were no longer the only story. The performance was the story. And yet, behind the spectacle, real lives were still being destroyed. Survivors lived with scars, both physical and emotional. Families grieved without answers, and police officers worked themselves to exhaustion, trying to piece together fragments of evidence that seemed deliberately scattered. Every letter reminded them of their failure. Every new threat deepened the wound. The Zodiac's threats against school children never materialized into action, but their power lay in what they represented. They expanded his reach from secluded couples and lone cab drivers to the very heart of the community. Anyone, anywhere, could be next. Fear became his currency, and with each threat, he grew richer. Even decades later, criminologists point to this moment as a turning point in the case. The Zodiac had revealed that he understood psychology as well as violence. He knew how to exploit the media, how to manipulate institutions, how to turn rumor into reality. He was more than a killer. He was a strategist. His murders had been his opening acts, but his letters had become the true stage where he performed. For the people of San Francisco, life moved on, but always with one eye on the shadows. Parents still sent their children to school, but with a nervous glance at the bus every morning. Taxi drivers still worked the streets, but with hands that shook when strangers entered their cabs. Couples still parked on quiet roads, but now with headlights kept on and doors locked. Ordinary routines became tinged with dread, as though the Zodiac's shadow stretched over every decision. What made his threats so powerful wasn't that they were carried out, but that they could be. The very possibility was enough to hold the city captive, and in that way the Zodiac proved himself not just a murderer but a manipulator of fear itself. The public had entered his game, the police were trapped in his riddles, and the newspapers had become his megaphone. With every letter, he reminded them that he was still out there, watching, waiting, deciding when and where to strike again. And soon, he would find new ways to keep his legend alive, ways that blurred the line between truth and performance, so completely that even today, it is hard to tell where the man ended and the myth began. By late 1969, and into 1970, the Zodiac's crimes had become only part of his story. What consumed the Bay Area, and much of the country, was the strange correspondence that followed them. Every letter, every cipher, every taunt, deepened the sense that the police weren't just dealing with a killer, they were dealing with a performer, one who relished the cat-and-mouse game more than the crimes themselves. The letters arrived in bursts, often in response to press coverage. Each one bore the Zodiac's crude crosshair symbol, as if branding his words with ownership. He belittled investigators, calling them blue pigs, mocking their inability to catch him. Sometimes he claimed credit for crimes that weren't his, muddying the waters with false confessions. Other times he taunted them with gruesome trophies, like additional pieces of Paul Stone's blood-stained shirt, proof that his words weren't bluffs. The tone of these letters was chillingly playful. He didn't rant incoherently like some anonymous crank. He wrote with precision, with an eerie mix of arrogance and detachment. In one letter, he joked about how easy it would be to kill, how San Francisco's people were like open-season targets. In another, He ridiculed the police patrols guarding school buses, mocking the idea that they could stop him if he chose to attack. He was a man who saw himself not as hunted, but as the hunter, and he wanted the whole city to know it. Police departments across jurisdictions were overwhelmed. Vallejo, Napa, and San Francisco each had pieces of the puzzle, but communication between them was imperfect. The Zodiac thrived in this chaos. His crimes crossed county lines, and his letters flooded multiple newspapers, ensuring that no single agency could fully control the case. He exploited the cracks in the system, knowing that his very mobility protected him. And then there were the ciphers. The 408-symbol cipher solved by Donald and Betty Harden had revealed his chilling manifesto, but he wasn't finished. He sent new codes, more complex, more cryptic. Some were cracked quickly, others remained mysteries for decades. The infamous 340-character cipher, mailed after Paul Stein's murder, taunted police for months. It would not be solved until half a century later, when modern cryptography and computing power finally revealed its message in 2020. Back in 1969, though, it was a wall of symbols, a puzzle that mocked every failed attempt. These ciphers weren't just puzzles, they were traps. Each one dangled the promise of answers, perhaps even his name, yet delivered only more riddles. The police and public alike were lured into solving them, investing hours, days, months into decoding lines that gave little more than gloating or vague threats. In this way, the Zodiac ensured that his presence lingered. Even when he wasn't killing, people were thinking about him, trying to decipher him. He had created a second crime scene, the mind. Investigators struggled to separate fact from fiction. Reports of possible Zodiac crimes poured in from across California. Some matched his methods, others didn't. Was he expanding his territory, or were other killers exploiting his fame? The uncertainty was part of the torment. The Zodiac didn't need to kill constantly. His legend allowed every unsolved murder to be linked to him, keeping him alive in the public imagination. The phone calls added another layer of dread. In Vallejo, Napa, and even to individuals connected to victims, the Zodiac's voice was sometimes heard, flat and calm, always deliberate, never frantic. Survivors of his attacks described the same tone, a man who seemed detached, as though killing were nothing more than another task on his list. Each call extended his reach beyond paper and into real time, making the nightmare immediate and personal. For the police, the frustration was unbearable. They had eyewitness descriptions, fingerprints, shell casings, and handwriting samples, but none of it pointed definitively to a suspect. Every lead seemed to dissolve. Some suspects were promising, others dead ends, but the Zodiac himself remained elusive. He knew it too. His letters constantly reminded investigators of their failure, like a teacher scolding students for not solving a lesson quickly enough. The public, meanwhile, had become divided. Some saw the Zodiac as a lunatic who would eventually burn out. Others feared he was a mastermind, too clever to ever be caught. Amateur sleuths sprang up everywhere, cryptography enthusiasts, armchair detectives, journalists digging through evidence. The Zodiac had turned ordinary citizens into his investigators, unwilling participants in his theater. By early 1970, his letters grew darker, laced with references to bombs and mass killings. He drew diagrams of explosive devices, claiming he could wipe out a school bus with the press of a button. Whether he truly possessed such weapons didn't matter. The fear was already planted, and that fear was enough to keep him at the center of attention. It became increasingly clear that the Zodiac's greatest weapon wasn't his gun or his knife. It was his ability to manipulate narrative. He dictated the pace of the story, forcing police and press alike to respond to his games. In doing so, he transformed himself into something larger than a criminal. He became a symbol, one that represented the failure of safety, the vulnerability of institutions, and the terrifying truth that one man's words could hold an entire city hostage. The cat-and-mouse game had no winner. Each time the police thought they were closing in, he slipped away. Each time the public hoped for closure, a new letter appeared. For the Zodiac, the chase was the point. He didn't just want to evade capture, he wanted to be pursued forever. And so, as 1970 wore on, the question remained: how do you catch a shadow? How do you cage a phantom who thrives on the chase itself? The answer would prove elusive, as the Zodiac's myth grew stronger, and his grip on the public's imagination grew tighter with every mocking word. By early 1970, the Zodiac's killings had already cemented him as one of America's most feared predators, but it was his words that transformed him into something more, a specter hovering over California's collective psyche. With each new letter, he widened the scope of his terror. No longer content to taunt about past murders, he began sketching futures drenched in blood, and in those visions, bombs played a starring role. In April of that year, a chilling package arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle. Inside was one of the Zodiac's most elaborate threats. A diagram, carefully drawn lines illustrated what he described as a death machine, a homemade bomb capable of destroying a school bus. His crude sketch depicted wires, explosives, and a triggering mechanism, complete with handwritten notes explaining how it would work. It wasn't just a threat, it was a blueprint of terror. Whether the device could actually function didn't matter. What mattered was the image it burned into the minds of parents, children, and police. For every mother putting her child on a bus, for every driver steering through morning fog, the diagram lingered like a phantom beneath the seats. The Zodiac had made fear portable, something you carried with you on the way to school, to work, to life itself. Law enforcement scrambled. Bomb squads were briefed. School bus routes were examined. Some officers were even assigned to shadow buses on their daily trips. Though no bombs were ever discovered, the threat alone was enough to alter the city's pulse. In this way, the Zodiac proved once again that he didn't need to pull a trigger to control lives. His pen was just as lethal. The letters that followed continued this theme of escalation. He described new ways he could kill, sniping from the tops of buildings, planting bombs in crowded areas, unleashing chaos at will. Sometimes he added grotesque humor, ridiculing police for their inability to stop him. Other times he slipped into almost grandiose tones, writing as though he were a dark prophet presiding over San Francisco's fate. What made these threats so unnerving was their plausibility. The Zodiac had already shown he could appear anywhere: rural roads, lakesides, city streets. If he wanted to plant a bomb, who was to say he couldn't? The uncertainty was his power. And then there was the way he treated the media. The newspapers were his chosen stage, and he played them masterfully. When they delayed printing his letters, he threatened to escalate. When they published them, he gloated about the attention. The press, caught between public safety and their own integrity, found themselves forced into the role of messenger for a killer who understood the mechanics of fear better than most dictators. For the police, the frustration only deepened. They had suspects, but no proof. They had handwriting samples, but nothing definitive. They had eyewitness descriptions, but no arrest. Each letter seemed to mock their impotence. Each blueprint of destruction widened the chasm between their duty to protect and their inability to stop him. Among the most disturbing aspects of his bomb threats was the sense of ritual. He spoke often of his slaves for the afterlife, tying his violence to a personal mythology that no one could fully decipher. His obsession wasn't merely with killing, but with leaving a legacy of control, of weaving himself into stories and fears that would outlast him. The bombs, real or imagined, were part of that tapestry. Symbols of power more than tools of destruction. Public reaction during this period was a mixture of dread and dark fascination. Newspapers sold more copies when his letters appeared. Amateur cryptographers and hobbyists pored over his ciphers, treating them as riddles to solve, almost like a deadly crossword. But beneath the spectacle was very real terror. Parents no longer saw school buses as safe. Couples hesitated before parking in secluded spots. Taxi drivers eyed their passengers with suspicion. The Zodiac had transformed the ordinary into the ominous. Even today, criminologists debate whether he ever intended to build a functioning bomb. Some argue that his diagrams contained enough detail to suggest knowledge of explosives. Others believe they were theatrical, designed only to frighten. But in either case, the outcome was the same. His shadow stretched larger, and his legend grew darker. In his later bomb-related letters, the Zodiac added a grotesque twist. He included tally marks, suggesting he was keeping score of intended victims. Whether fabricated or real, these marks painted him as a predator who saw his terror campaign as a game, one where lives were tokens and fear was the scoreboard. And always, he signed off with his symbol, that stark circle with a cross. Simple, crude, but unforgettable. More than just an emblem, it became a brand of terror, stamped onto each threat, ensuring that every word carried the weight of recognition. For San Francisco, 1970 was the year the Zodiac stopped being just a killer. He became an idea, a force capable of turning ink and diagrams into widespread panic. And though bombs never exploded, their echoes haunted every conversation, every newspaper headline, every worried glance at a school bus rolling down the street. The Zodiac didn't need explosions to leave a crater. He had already blown a hole straight through the heart of the city's sense of safety. As the Zodiac's legend grew, so too did the list of suspects. For every letter he sent, for every taunt that filled the headlines, police received dozens of tips, each pointing to a different man who supposedly fit the bill. Neighbors suspected neighbors, friends whispered about friends. Even casual acquaintances became targets of paranoia. Yet for all the speculation, the truth was elusive. The Zodiac was everywhere in rumor, but nowhere in reality. Among the earliest and most enduring suspects was Arthur Lee Allen, a man whose name would echo through the case for decades. Allen was a former schoolteacher, dismissed after troubling allegations of inappropriate behavior with children. He was an eccentric figure, solitary, moody, often discussing violent fantasies with acquaintances. What made him particularly intriguing to investigators was his proximity to Zodiac events. He lived near Vallejo, frequented areas where the murders occurred, and owned a wristwatch with the brand name Zodiac stamped on its face. When police interviewed him, Allen gave off an unsettling aura. He mentioned his fascination with the idea of hunting humans, echoing almost word for word the philosophy Zodiac had written in his first cipher. Friends recalled him speaking about disguises, codes, and even the idea of taping a flashlight to a gun, a method the Zodiac had reportedly used at Blue Rock Springs. To detectives, it seemed too close to be coincidence. And yet, every time they leaned in, the evidence slipped away. Handwriting experts compared Allen's script to Zodiac's letters and declared they didn't match. Fingerprints taken from Allen didn't align with the partial prints lifted from crime scenes. A search of his home turned up weapons, but none definitively linked to the murders. Time and again, Allen seemed to hover on the edge of guilt without ever stepping firmly into it. For years he remained the prime suspect, a man investigators believed was their killer, but the proof they needed never came. He wasn't the only suspect. The list sprawled into the hundreds. Men with military backgrounds, men obsessed with codes, men reported by ex-wives or jealous co-workers. Some were eccentric loners, others seemingly ordinary family men. Each name sparked headlines, each one investigated, but always the same outcome: suspicion without resolution. The Zodiac was a master of remaining just beyond reach. Part of the difficulty lay in the very nature of his crimes. Unlike killers with specific victim types or clear patterns, Zodiac thrived on unpredictability. Young couples on rural roads, a taxi driver in the city, threats against schoolchildren. His randomness defied profiling. Police psychologists struggled to sketch his personality. Was he a sadist? A narcissist? A man driven by delusions of afterlife slaves? Or simply someone intoxicated by power? Every answer opened new questions. The jurisdictional divides only made matters worse. Vallejo Police, San Francisco Police, the Napa County Sheriff's Department, and the California Department of Justice all had pieces of the puzzle. But in an era before seamless data sharing, communication broke down. Files were duplicated, reports misplaced, leads overlooked. Zodiac exploited this chaos, moving across boundaries like a shadow slipping through cracks. Amid the dead ends, the press played its own role in fueling speculation. Newspapers speculated about suspects, sometimes prematurely, sometimes irresponsibly. The public devoured these stories, eager for a face to pin to the fear that haunted their nights. But each time a promising suspect was dismissed, the Zodiac's myth only grew larger. He was not just a killer, he was the unknown, the unseen, the one who could be anyone. Even as suspects piled up, the letters never stopped. Each one seemed to mock the very process of investigation. He bragged about walking past officers after Paul Steen's murder. He teased about planting bombs that never appeared. He even scrawled lines like SFPD =0, Zodiac =37, as though the murders were points in a game, his score forever rising while the police remained empty-handed. For detectives, the frustration was unbearable. They had witnesses, but not enough. They had handwriting samples, but not conclusive. They had fingerprints, but partial. Every piece of evidence seemed to whisper possibilities, without shouting answers. And in that liminal space between suspicion and certainty, the Zodiac thrived. Decades later, DNA evidence would be tested against surviving envelopes and stamps from Zodiac's letters. Hopes were high that modern science could succeed, where mid-century forensics had failed. Yet the results were inconclusive, contaminated by handling or too degraded to confirm. Once again the Zodiac seemed to vanish, leaving only shadows where certainty should have been. For the families of victims, the endless carousel of suspects was agony. Each new name brought hope, only to be dashed by lack of proof. Justice seemed perpetually around the corner, but never arriving. The man who had taunted their city had managed something rare in American crime. He became eternal, his identity suspended in mystery even as decades passed. The suspects and dead ends reveal something crucial about the Zodiac story. It wasn't just his violence that made him terrifying, but his ability to become a mirror. Everyone saw someone different in him, a neighbor, a co-worker, a loner on the bus. He was whoever fear imagined him to be, and that, more than any letter or cipher, made him invincible. By the early 1970s, the Zodiac's name had become a legend whispered in every corner of California. His letters, his codes, his taunts, they had dominated front pages and nightly news for years. But as the decade wore on, something strange began to happen. The Zodiac, who had thrived on attention, seemed to fade from the spotlight. His reign of terror didn't end with a dramatic capture, or even a confirmed final murder. Instead, it dissolved into silence, rumors, and shadows. The last confirmed Zodiac letter arrived in 1974, addressed to the San Francisco Chronicle. In it, he praised the film The Exorcist, calling it the best satirical comedy that I have ever seen. It was a bizarre note, both mocking and detached, signed with his familiar crosshair symbol. But unlike his earlier letters, it lacked urgency. It didn't boast of fresh kills or promise of imminent attacks. Instead, it felt almost tired, as if the performance had run its course. After years of terror, the killer who had once dictated headlines simply stopped writing. This silence left police and the public in a limbo that persists to this day. Did he die? Was he arrested under another name? Did he lose interest, content with the chaos he had already caused? Or did he simply shift tactics, his crimes hidden in unsolved murders across the state? Without his letters to guide them, investigators had no way of knowing. The mystery only deepened. In the years that followed, possible Zodiac crimes continued to surface. Some were eerily similar: lone victims, cryptic notes, random violence. Others stretched the pattern so thin that they seemed more like desperate attempts to tie everything unsolved to the Zodiac myth. Copycats emerged, sending letters in his style, drawing his symbol, and even fabricating ciphers. But handwriting experts often dismissed them as forgeries. The real Zodiac, they said, had a voice too distinct to be easily imitated. Yet the possibility of imitators highlighted a crucial point. The Zodiac had achieved what few killers ever could. He had created not just fear but a template. His methods, the letters, the codes, the taunts, became tools for others who craved notoriety. In this way, his shadow extended far beyond his confirmed acts. The man himself may have disappeared, but his idea lived on in every hoax, every copycat, every new suspect named decades later. For law enforcement, the fading of his presence was as frustrating as his active years. Investigators had been fueled by his provocations, chasing his words as much as his bullets. Without new letters, the trail grew colder. Files gathered dust, leads expired, detectives retired or moved on. Each unsolved murder in California became a potential Zodiac case, stretching resources thin and drowning truth in speculation. The public, meanwhile, never fully let him go. Books were written, films inspired, documentaries produced. Each new generation discovered the Zodiac's story and asked the same questions their parents once did. Who was he? Why did he stop? Could he still be alive? The fascination was less about the murders themselves and more about the absence of answers. The Zodiac had designed his story to end in a question mark, and the world couldn't resist trying to solve it. Even the letters themselves became artifacts of fear, stored in evidence lockers and analyzed under microscopes. Handwriting experts, linguists, and even psychologists studied them for hidden meaning. Was there a clue buried in the phrasing, a slip of identity in his syntax? Was his arrogance his undoing? Or was it the very thing that kept him safe? The silence that followed made these relics more precious. They were the only direct connection to a killer who had otherwise vanished. The 1970s brought other serial killers into the headlines. The Manson family, the Hillside Stranglers, later the Golden State Killer. Each new name slowly pushed the Zodiac out of the center of the spotlight, but he never disappeared entirely. His myth remained intact, preserved by the very mystery of his absence. Unlike most killers, who were eventually caught, killed, or forgotten, the Zodiac lingered, eternal in his anonymity. What's most chilling about his fade is how deliberate it feels. The Zodiac had always been a man of control. He dictated when the press wrote about him, when police panicked, when fear spread. It's almost poetic that he dictated his own exit too. He didn't let the world watch him crumble in handcuffs. He didn't let detectives parade him before cameras. He simply slipped back into the shadows, leaving the city to wonder if the performance was over or if the curtain had merely paused. For families of victims, the fading of the Zodiac was salt in the wound. The unanswered questions, the lack of justice, the suspicion that he might have been living among them the whole time. It was a torment that never eased. Every passing year made the possibility of closure slimmer. The silence was not peace. It was abandonment. And so, the Zodiac's fade from the spotlight became part of his power. His mystery thrived not on presence but on absence. His legend didn't die with his crimes. It lived on precisely because he left no ending. Like a book missing its final chapter, the story forced readers to keep turning pages that weren't there. In the end, the Zodiac's greatest trick may not have been the murders, the letters, or the bombs that never detonated. It may have been his ability to vanish, to dissolve into rumor and speculation while leaving behind a myth strong enough to survive for generations. He killed, he taunted, he terrified, and then he walked away, letting the world write the rest of the story for him. The Zodiac case is not just a story of unsolved murders. It is a story about fear, obsession, and the way a single man manipulated an entire society. Unlike most killers, who are remembered through the brutality of their crimes, the Zodiac is remembered through the words he left behind. His letters, his codes, his threats, they became a kind of scripture of terror, written in ink but etched into memory with blood. His legacy lives in questions. Who was he? Why did he do it? How many did he kill? The confirmed murders stand at 5, with 2 survivors, but his boasts claimed dozens more. Was it bluster, or was there truth buried in his numbers? The uncertainty is part of the grip he still has on the public imagination. Without answers, he remains alive in theory, in speculation, in the imagination of every detective and amateur sleuth who has pored over his case files. The cultural impact is undeniable. Films like Dirty Harry and Zodiac borrowed his shadow to tell stories of crime and obsession. Books and documentaries dissect his every word. Online forums still debate suspects, decode letters, and argue about details long faded from official reports. Entire careers have been built around the attempt to name him, and yet, the truth remains out of reach. The Zodiac lives not as a man but as an idea, one that has seeped into American culture like a stain that will not wash out. For law enforcement, the case is both a wound and a lesson. It exposed the vulnerabilities of a fragmented system, the ways in which separate jurisdictions failed to share information effectively. It revealed how a clever manipulator could exploit the media, turning newspapers into unwilling accomplices in his performance. And it showed how fear itself could be weaponized, how the mere threat of violence could paralyze a city more than the violence itself. For the families of the victims, the Zodiac's legacy is something much darker. Their loved ones became part of a myth they never asked to join. Betty Lou Jensen, David Faraday, Darlene Ferrin, Cecilia Shepard, Paul Stein, their names are too often overshadowed by the man who killed them. Behind the codes and ciphers, behind the headlines and theories, lie real people whose lives were cut short. Their stories, their futures, were stolen, and justice has never come. Decades later, the case continues to haunt. Advances in DNA technology have offered hope, but so far, results remain inconclusive. The letters are degraded, the evidence tainted by years of handling. Each new test brings anticipation, followed by disappointment, yet the hope persists. Perhaps one day, science will give what time and police work could not, a name. But even if the Zodiac were identified tomorrow, would it end his story, or has he already achieved what he wanted, immortality through fear and mystery? Unlike other killers whose names fade once justice is done, the Zodiac's anonymity is his crown. He is the faceless spectre who could be anyone, the eternal puzzle with missing pieces. His power lies not in what we know, but in what we never will. His legend also speaks to something deeper about human nature, our compulsion to solve mysteries, to seek patterns, to bring order to chaos. The Zodiac exploited that compulsion, dangling ciphers and clues like bait. He knew we would chase him endlessly, and in doing so he guaranteed that his name would outlast him. In a way, he turned society into his final victim, forever searching, forever unsettled. And so the Zodiac remains in the shadows, Half a century later, he is a ghost that lingers not in cemeteries, but in headlines, in documentaries, in conversations that begin with, "Who do you think he really was?" His crimes, though decades old, still ripple outward, shaping the way we think about fear, about crime, about the limits of justice. In the end, the Zodiac story is less about him and more about us. About a city held hostage by words. About a culture that turned a faceless killer into an icon. About the human need to believe that every puzzle has an answer, even when it doesn't. Perhaps that is his final victory, to remain unsolved, to exist forever at the edge of certainty, to ensure that every time we look at his letters or his symbols, we are reminded not of who he was, but of what we cannot know. And so the curtain falls on the Zodiac Killer. Letters from the shadows. A story with no ending. A letter with no signature. A mystery, not just about a killer, but about the darkness that lingers when questions remain unanswered.